So let's start at the beginning. How did you first get started in, call it faith-based investing, call it faith-based activism? What got you into this?
Well, I think in general, when my own family does investing, we think about our values. So it's not even necessarily we start from the top line of, hey, we need this to be Christian investing, right? It's like, what are our values? Where do they align? And I think that's something a lot of investors do. So when investors from the outside look at it, if they're not familiar with faith-based investing, they are familiar with values-based investing because a lot of investors do it. It just so happens for some investors, their sole value when they're looking at the market is, okay, what are the analytical numbers that I'm going to, sort of look at here and what's important to me? What do I think is going to, sort of happen in the future? But for folks like me, we're looking at that, but we're also looking at what are the values of the company. We believe companies with certain values are going to do better in the long run for a number of different reasons. And so for me and my wife, at least on an individual level, it started from the time we were married because we wanted to align our values as well as we could with where our money went. And I think over time, what we've seen, especially in the past, let's say 4 to 6 years, is a real movement that's increased the amount of money that you're seeing go in this direction. And I think on a larger basis globally, you're going to see that continue to grow because, sort of like here in the United States, you've seen what we've called the Great Migration. Okay, so and that played a role in this election where a lot of folks decided, you know what, I no longer am going to live where I live on the basis of, hey, this is where my job is. I want to go somewhere I'm values aligned. So you saw a lot of Democrats move to blue states. You saw a lot of conservatives move to red states or states where they were maybe purple like Florida used to be, but they saw their values aligning in the new administration there. And now as a result of that, it's a very red state, and I think a lot of people don't see Florida turning purple again for a very long time. So it's sort of like that, but in the investment world.
What is your ultimate goal? I mean, part of it is the values of you and your family, your wife. Is it to sleep better at night and feel better, that you're right with God, as we used to say in my church? Or is it to change the behavior of the corporation?
Well, I would say I have fundamentally two different ones. So from a faith-based perspective, it's obviously my wife and I want to sleep well at night and know we're not investing in something that is diametrically opposed to our faith. Secondary goal for me, just as somebody who wants to see America win, is I want to see corporations get out of the business of divisive everything. So if something you're doing is going to be extremely divisive in the marketplace and it's going to divide your employees, divide your consumers, I think it's bad business. And I think that a lot of the corporate world lost sight of that because ultimately, my thesis is many corporate executives lost sight of who their customer actually is. They started to believe it was BlackRock or maybe State Street or Vanguard. And in reality, your customer is who you need to walk through your door. There's maybe some company structures where your customer looks more like a BlackRock, but for the vast majority of consumer-based companies, it's us. It's the people who walk through your doors. And so if you're embracing policies that are going to divide people, your business is going to suffer in the long run. And so that's why on the side of, say, the DEI and woke policy, I've been very vocal because my desire there isn't to conform the companies to my values, because at the end of the day, I know if they fully conform to my values, you're going to divide this other group of people and it's going to be incredibly unfair to them. So I'm not advocating for a total theocracy here in corporate America. It's more so I don't want to invest in companies that are going to diametrically oppose everything I believe in such a visceral way that I would feel I'm doing a disservice not just to my country, but to my faith by investing in them.
It raises a really fundamental question for me, at least. There are other faith-based investing outfits, investment firms, things like that, who have a very different view on diversity, equity, inclusion. They're all for it.
Yeah.
You're all against it. And they believe what they're doing is scriptural as well. So is one right and the other wrong?
Yeah, there'll be people who are mad at me for this, but that's okay. That's not a new thing for me. It's, they believe in something that I would call comfortable Christianity, which is one where you want to attract the largest number of people, but it's based off false doctrine. And so the idea for them is that they'll take a cherry-picked line and say, this line means that we need to behave this way. There is nothing in the Bible that says we should, encapsulate our corporate structure around the idea that racism is okay. I don't think racism is ever okay. And DEI ultimately, when you break it down, it does not mean that you love diversity. It doesn't mean that you love inclusion, because if you look on the very top line, just rational thinking, you immediately find that they're actually very much not inclusive of, let's say, Christians. So let's look at the ERG structure, Employee Resource Groups in corporate America. We did an investigation of basically all of the largest companies in America. We could not find one Christian ERG group. We also couldn't find ERG groups for two other groups of people, Jews. In fact, we found one for Jews. In the entirety of the Fortune 500, we found one for Jews. We found zero for white people. Black folks, Latinos like myself, we have ERGs at every company. Asians, they have ERGs at every company. White folks, Christians, Jews get denied almost every single time. That tells you right there, they're not interested in inclusion in any sense. It's about pushing what I've described as a Trojan horse for left-wing policy. And so if you can call them faith-based investors who embrace DEI, what they're really doing is they're embracing left-wing policy. And I think that if you look at the structure of corporate America, you can't survive if you make it into a structure that is fully adherent to one party or the other. It's got to be able to serve everybody in the country, and ultimately DEI doesn't do that. So even if you wanted to pretend DEI was ultimately a good thing, if you know that more than half the country finds it detestable for any number of reasons, it's divisive for your business. So at that point, you have to just do sort of rational thought within your team. How can we do the things that we proclaim to want to do without violating the law? And at the end of the day, if you look at these policies like racial quotas for hiring, it's not possible. You can't have a racial quota for hiring and not violate the law. But therein lies the real core of almost every DEI policy in America, is that we should look at people and judge them by their skin tone, which is diametrically opposed to the ideas of the civil rights movement, which was that we're not supposed to judge people by their skin tone. We're actually supposed to look at them as an individual and say, your value lies in your actions, what you can do, your merit. And so that's what we want to see. But about those, so-called faith-based investors who embrace DEI, I think that it's based on false doctrine, and Christians would call it heresy in many ways. I do think that there's certain things that we can agree on, like love your neighbor. When I think about that, because they like to go to that for DEI, I love my neighbor by not looking at them by their skin color and judging them by it. I love them by looking at their actions and looking at the merit of what they do and judging them in that respect. And when I see somebody who's down and out and who needs help in my community, I want to reach out and help them. But that's a personal, individual charity thing or something within your church, not corporate policy.
So I'm going to push you a little bit because I really want to understand it.
Yeah.
Go back to the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
The one thing I see in the scriptures, in the Gospels, was he bent over backwards for the most excluded, the lepers,
yes,
the tax collectors, the Samaritans, who in some ways... Prostitutes.
Yeah.
In some ways were like the way, frankly, women and Black Americans have been treated for much of the 20th century here. So what's wrong?
A lot of people describe them all as marginalized, right?
Yeah, and so what's wrong with bending over backwards the way I think Jesus might have done for those sorts of people?
So what you described with Jesus is his outreach to sinners. And I wouldn't equate that to Black folks in America or to women, because I don't see all women or Black folks as sinners in America. I would say, though, when you look at that part of the gospel, it's a common mistake people make when they say, well, why don't you do X, X, and X? Because Jesus hung out with prostitutes, Jesus hung out with that, and it's the Jesus hippie doctrine, right? Like, Jesus hung out with all these people, like, just be a hippie, that's what Jesus was. It's diametrically opposed to what Jesus was actually doing. He wasn't outreaching to prostitutes and folks who were sinners because he wanted to hang out in their sin. He was hanging out with them because he wanted them to reject their sin. It was Jesus's greatest hope that they would reject what they were doing that was diametrically opposed to sort of what God wanted them to do. And he cared about their souls so much that he would sit with them as long as it took to try to bring them out of sin. So he didn't sit with them out of a desire to say, I accept your sin. He sat with them in a desire to change their hearts and change the sin.
Put aside whether the leper was a sinner or not.
Yeah.
Certainly, you look at the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
It is an exaltation of the least among us.
Yeah.
The last shall be first and the first last.
Yes.
And so certainly Jesus, without regard to sin, was really trying to bend over backwards for the least fortunate among us.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that all of our churches need to do. So for instance, our church, they're very engaged in making sure that the least among us have everything that we can possibly do to help them, to lift them up. For instance, I believe in charity on an individual basis versus a government basis, for instance. And so myself, when we had the hurricane come through in East Tennessee and in West North Carolina, immediate need was communication. Nobody could get a hold of anybody. And so I personally purchased as many Starlinks as there were in Middle Tennessee. We literally bought out all the Home Depots here. and we had so many Starlinks and got, Elon Musk helped out to get us all connected really quickly. I sent out all the guys who work for me and I said, set these up everywhere people need communication. And we did that on an individual level, and I'm still today paying for that because the government throughout the Biden administration never came in and put together the communication again. And so this was an ongoing need for them. That's something where you'd have folks, on the other side of this say, that should be coming from this place or that place, but I'm a big believer it should come from the individual and from the church. And so it's the same thing when you look at, say, the homeless problem in California. California has a homeless industrial complex that essentially operates on the need for there to continue to be homelessness because they make billions and billions of dollars year over year on there being homeless people. And if suddenly they fix the problem, guess what? They no longer have that money because there's not a homelessness problem. It's always been my contention that churches have a responsibility to step in as well as the government to end the problem together and actually end it. And there's ways to do that, but instead they've propped up this homeless industrial complex. So as corporations and the government look at how they engage with how do we, sort of help the least among us, there are ways, because I'm not arguing that corporations should never do anything good for their community. What I'm arguing is they should engage in ways that are not divisive. So say, for instance, you live in an area like we do where during the winters it can get quite cold. Corporations engaging in a program where they could get coats and get people warm places to sleep when it's freezing out, I think that's great for a company to do. And I hate to say it, but corporations only do these things for PR reasons anyways. I mean, that's the truth. Everybody knows, they want to look good, right? They want to look like they're doing good things. Well, that's a good thing. Everybody can agree on that. So why are we so focused? It's almost like the climate change debate, where we focus on the disagreements instead of on the broad agreements. Because if we all reshifted the debate and we said, hey, we can all agree we want our kids to have cleaner air, cleaner water. How do we do that? And we look at the ways that we actually agree and we broadly approach those issues, we're fixing what many would argue is the problem, while at the same time getting rid of the arguments and the division and just focusing on actually getting things done. But the truth is, there's a lot of people who profit on there being that division. And so that's the thing that I'd say I'm most focused on getting rid of, even though there's detractors who would say I'm divisive.
Well, let's pursue that just a bit. You've been very active in the DEI space. You're against companies pursuing aggressive DEI policies. Is there an affirmative version of your activism? Could you evolve into someone who's active in favor of affordable housing? In favor of clean air, clean water, and things like that. On the affirmative side, to say these are affirmative values that are Christian values that corporations should be pursuing, and we should invest in those companies.
Yeah, I see it sort of differently. I look at it this way. I've had these conversations with CEOs at major companies where they've asked, okay, if we're getting rid of all these things, what are things you do think are not divisive? And I'll give them a list of things that I don't see as divisive that I think everybody could broadly accept as good, right? But that would be predicated on a company's desire to engage in these things. I don't want to outwardly go tell a company, you need to spend $100 million on this, right? Because frankly, I'm a big believer in capitalism. And so if they don't need to engage in, these different things, they should be focused on making money. So if I'm an investor, and I'm taking that hat, then I'm saying, yeah, you should engage in certain ways because there is sort of the forward-facing image of the company to consider, and you want that to be in alignment with the brand image that you have, right? But it needs to be reasonable. Like, look at JP Morgan. They spent $30 billion on racial equity, and it's a very broad term. But the way that they spent that money, in my view, is terribly irresponsible, and it didn't do a service to the shareholders. And so I think, Jamie is coming along to that view now after I exposed all their DEI policies. He recently, used some language I won't repeat here to describe their DEI policies now. And I think that's a broad shift from where they were, where he was a big champion of DEI. And I think, it's like DEI in theory versus DEI in reality. I'm the one holding up a mirror of what it actually is in reality. Because in theory, a lot of people really like the theory because it made them feel good. It's like warm, fuzzy words, right? But in reality, it resulted in a lot of really bizarre things that I think are diametrically opposed to the values companies want to put out there. For instance, I did probably around 200 plus DEI trainings that major companies put out there for their employees to do. I wanted to do each one of these myself, not just people who work for me, because I wanted to understand what are employees actually having to do. Is it as bad as some of them say it is? And it is. But there's also a commonality that I found really interesting. Every one of these has a resource section at the end where they recommend podcasts for you to listen to, books to read, things like that. The number one book recommendation that was a commonality among all these DEI trainings was Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. That book is predicated on the idea that you can only be anti-racist if you oppose capitalism. You must be anti-capitalist to be anti-racist. And you had the largest corporations in the world telling their employees to read that book. That seems diametrically opposed to the idea of what the corporation's supposed to be doing, right? They're a capitalist company. They're supposed to be making money. And then they're telling their employees to embrace communism.
Deeply ironic. I mean, actually, one of the taglines for us is Stories of Capitalism. Is what we do at Wall Street Week. But in part because, I believe at least, some of the greatest things that have been done in the world have been through capitalism.
Yeah. Capitalism saved my family's lives. You know, I wouldn't be here without capitalism. I wouldn't be. Because America, if it had been a communist country, there would have been nowhere for Cubans to flee to. And I know my DNA, I know what's in me, I know what type of person I am. I have no question I would have been killed by the Castro regime because I have family members who were. And so I know I'm not the type of person who could have just sat back and watched as a country eroded and people's lives were taken in many different ways. You know, I have a family member, you hear Bernie Sanders talk about the wonderful healthcare system in Cuba. In reality, what that looked like for a family member of mine is they were sick for a very long time. They tried to get an appointment. It took them years to get one. By the time they got it, they had terminal cancer. It could have been caught 3-4 years earlier. It took them that long to just get in. And at that point, they wouldn't even give her pain medication because the money didn't make sense. You're gonna die, so why would we waste money giving you pain medication? So she died on a cold metal bed in some rundown place in the middle of Cuba. And that's what some people on the left here in America want for our healthcare system. That's the way I see it. Capitalism saved my life and it saved my family's life. So I'm not the only one. If you look at just human history, the greatest savior beyond Jesus, in my view, of the human race has been capitalism. Nothing has saved lives the way capitalism has. You've seen communism kill well over 100 million people. And you know, ultimately, capitalism, at the end of the day, when you boil it down, over the long run, will lean right wing, that is. And if you look at sort of the economic structure of what the left embraces on a global level right now, all roads lead to communism. Whether it's a new form of communism or the old one, it doesn't really matter because they all lead to the same place. And so that's fundamentally how I see it and why capitalism is so important and is at the core of what we're protecting with this project to end DEI.
Coming back to your activism, I understand you're saying it's hard to get a corporation to do something if they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But you seem to be doing a pretty good job of that when it comes to shutting down DEI. Why can't you use that same ability? For example, Jamie Dimon, whether it's $30 billion or $20 billion or $10 billion, say, take that money and put it toward this affirmative good that would be a Christian value.
Well, I'll give you an example. I can't say which company, but if you did research, you'd find out who it is because I gave them an off-the-record agreement. But there was a company that asked me affirmatively, what would be a good way to spend our money, right? And there's this great equine therapy place. They do equine therapy for kids, and especially kids who have been abused, kids who are disabled. And I said, that's a place that would be wonderful. They always need help, and they're always serving kids of all different races, all different backgrounds. That's something everybody from every political ideology can get behind. So that's an example. Like, I'm advocating behind the scenes. If you want to put your money into practice to do these charitable acts, do it in ways that are not going to divide people, that everybody can rally around and go, that's an amazing thing, right? I'd also encourage our churches to get more engaged on the local level because I am disappointed, frankly, there's a lot of mega churches out there who they raise a lot of money and they don't do a lot in their local communities. And you know, it seems like they're, in many cases, more interested in getting PR in some other country and you know, like building a school there. Not to say that's a bad thing, but their local area has all these problems and all these needs and they're not engaging their local communities. So it's not just corporations that I would say I'd give this advice to. It's local pastors, and I've had those discussions with them because I do see a disconnect, and I see why it actually brings some people to feel like they're further away from God because they look in their own community for help, and they'll knock on the doors of a church, and there's no help. And I think that's something that, you know, it makes me feel ashamed, even on a personal level as a Christian, that happens all the time on a day-to-day basis. People go and they seek out help and the church is supposed to be there and they're just not present.
You've mentioned right-left division more than once, which is an issue in the country without a doubt. How much of what you're doing is scriptural, religious, as opposed to political, or do you see a real line between those two? Do they blur?
I see it as intertwined. I think that's the best way I would describe it. They're very much intertwined, and I think that's reflective. I think of many people within the new Trump administration as well. They see it as something that is all intertwined. And again, it's not to say that we want a theocracy in the country. I don't. I'm a big believer in religious liberty. I think that the minute you take that away, very dangerous things can happen. And so I think it's important to stand up for people who don't believe what I believe too. But I do see them as intertwined, and I think there are a lot of common values. Let's say among Abrahamic religions. I think there's a lot of common values, and that covers a vast majority of the country, frankly. And so I think if we look at it as a values-based thing, and that's kind of how I approach politics, my religious values align with a political party. And so it's very simple in that respect for me when I consider who am I going to vote for, what policies am I going to champion. But there are things where you do differ. Like I would say, about a decade ago, the Republican Party wasn't as on board with school choice, and I was very much on board with school choice from day one, because I do believe, and this is one actually that is sort of ironic on the DEI level, because all of these groups that say they support DEI oppose school choice. All the unions who say they're for DEI oppose school choice. There is no greater way to uplift minorities in America than to give choice to parents so that they can take their kids out of failing schools and put them in good schools. And it's mainly minorities who are affected by the worst public schools in America. So that's not lost on me, but apparently it's lost on this other side that proclaim that they care about minorities. So that's one where I did have an opposing view at one point, and I was happy to speak up about it, because that was a faith-based view for me in many ways, that I felt like there's all these parents out there who they pay taxes, they wish their kid could be in a Christian school or a Jewish school, whatever it might be, and they simply couldn't do it because of the taxes they were paying in for public school. And I felt like, well, there's a way you could shift culture in this country, is you could get a better values alignment from parents and their kids by opening up school choice. But then over time, the Republican Party became very, much champions of this policy. And so I think over time, I've only seen it intertwine more.
Coming to investments, and value-based, Christian-based, religious-based investment, are you willing to leave money on the table? Because there's a lot of people that talk about DEI companies actually maybe doing better. I don't think that's established, but there are some studies that suggest that. Are you willing to take lower returns for your values?
Yes, that hasn't been the case, to be perfectly honest with you, but I am willing to 100%, because I look at it this way. I could die with a pot of money that's bigger, or I could die on my deathbed one day with my kids able to look at me and know that their dad had integrity, always lived by what he said he was going to live by, and was not a hypocrite, and really taught them the values that I lived by. And I would rather have no money in that pot and have my kids be able to look at me that way when I die. And that's not everybody, not everybody feels that way. But for me, I think one thing a lot of people can relate to is I spent a lot of time from the time I was really young to now asking myself, what is the meaning of life? Why are we all here? And for me, I figured out what it was, and it was my kids. That was the meaning of life. It was like, that is why I'm here, is to train them up and to be a good steward and to really teach them what matters in life. And ultimately, that is the continuation of the human race. It's how we excel, it's how we advance. It's why we're here, why we have all these tools around us, like cameras and lights, because the people who came before us said the meaning of their life was our ancestors. And so that's something that's always in my head when I look at investing is, how are my kids going to look at me? And then there's this other side that says, you also want to do well because you want to set up your children well to be able to do well in their lives and go after their dreams. So while those two things go together, what I've always taught my kids is at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is that integrity, and so you've got to stick to what you believe in, even if it hurts.